Good evening, everyone. I think it's time to get started. Thank you very much for joining our event, Climate Stories from the Anthropocene. My name is Daniel, and I'm one of Anthroposphere's 3 head editors next to Vinita and Divya, whom you will meet later as well. I joined Anthroposphere about a year ago when I was doing my MPhil at Oxford University. And before we kick off the event, let me just say a couple of things about our magazine, and then we'll jump right into it. So just by way of introduction, what is Anthroposphere actually? We are an interdisciplinary magazine on all things related to climate change and the environment broadly understood. The name actually comes from geology. In geology, the term anthroposphere describes that part of the environment that is made or modified by humans for use in human activities and human habitats. And we think that concept nicely reflects our vision of capturing interactions between human, non-human, and more than human elements in all their diversity, including disciplines such as natural science. We have lots of pieces about pop culture, economics, policy, politics, literature, and many, many more. So it's a very broad scope that we publish. We also see Anthroposphere as an artistic outlet to help realize what we think is an enormous potential of art in elucidating, knowing, experiencing, and confronting environmental phenomena. And I think that is also another sort of distinctive feature of Anthroposphere. We publish mainly print issues, about 1, maximum 2 per year, but you can also find pretty much all of our articles online, and we are entirely student-run and non-profit, so pretty low scale in that sense. Just a couple of words about the magazine's history. It was founded in 2018, so it's pretty young. The idea was to fill the gap in journalistic outlets dedicated exclusively to environmental and climate issues. And we have published 7 issues to date, 5 of which are available in print and which you can buy on our website if you would like to. And we are working very hard on the 8th issue right now. And we have published about 120 pieces to date, and lots of art as well, along with the pieces. So we've grown quite a bit over the past years. Our core team now involves the 3 head editors. We have 1 art director, we have a social media director, we have a sales and sponsorship director, and multiple line editors that we regularly work with. And most importantly, of course, there's a variety of contributing artists and writers from all types of backgrounds that help us publish our magazine. So having said these things about the magazine, let me just give you a short teaser of what the evening will look like, what you can expect. So next up, right after this, to give you an idea of the type of content that we publish and that we work on at Anthroposphere, we will have 2 authors from our latest issue, issue 7, read out and reflect on their pieces. First off, we'll have Melina Dick, who will talk about her piece, A Tour of the Anthropocene. And then we will have Zach Boyd, who will share his reportage, A Quiet Epidemic. And after that, we will shift perspective a bit. We'll invite Shannon Osaka and Carl Dutman onto the virtual stage, with whom we will discuss ways and forms of storytelling around the climate crisis that steer away from traditional climate framings, such as disaster narratives or techno-optimism or that sort. So that's promising to be interesting. And then we will have ample time for questions and discussions with you, the audience. So without much further ado, can I ask Melina to join me and hand over to her? Thanks.
Certainly. Thank you for that introduction. Should I just jump into reading, Daniel? Can you all hear me fine?
Yep, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Great. All right. So this is an excerpt from my piece, A Tour of the Anthropocene from 35,000 feet. In its temporal and spatial immensity, the Anthropocene is difficult to comprehend. I began to visualize it from 35,000 feet up through a flight I took regularly while I was living in Peru. It takes about 55 minutes on a mid-sized commercial jet to fly from Pucallpa, Peru to Jorge Chávez International Airport in Lima. In the first minutes while gaining altitude, the Amazon forest spreads below. It is a patchwork of greens, the new green of regrowing forest, the dry yellow green of pasture land, and the incongruous hexagonal black green of oil palm plantations. To the south in the ascent out of Pucallpa is the Ucayali River. Snaking through the leafy patchwork, this river is wide and flat and navigable, a highway for products and people, and for the rich silt that nourishes thousands of small farms along its banks. In local cosmovision, the Ucayali is the great mother anaconda who created the world. The Creator Mother River provides for the lives of all who inhabit its banks, from indigenous farmers to timber capitalists. Yet, for all the benefits the river brings, living alongside the Ucayali poses grave risks. The Ucayali has entered the Anthropocene. Flooding is now dangerously unpredictable. The Andes now rise 3,000 sharp meters out of the rainforest. The Cordillera, Peru's spine. You can gaze down at tiny villages perched on soaring plateaus, communities so remote that the closest you are ever likely to come to them is whizzing by at 35,000 feet. Then suddenly the ground yawns open below. Inverted rings of excavated earth mark mines. In pursuit of copper, silver, and gold, humans undercut Andean peaks. The mountains are known in Quechua as Tiracuna, or earth beings. Local people witness the earth beings slashed open to extract their marrow and understand that the mountains are murdered by the mines that hollow out their bodies. Here at the flight zenith, we pass through our tours nadir, a graveyard of the Anthropocene. Now the Cordillera drops away below the plain, and Lima's perpetual coastal fog slithers up the ravines, casting a grainy film across the sprawling city. The plain breaks through the clouds. Cerulean ocean waves glitter below. Penthouse apartments bend over Lima's beachside highway known as the Costa Verde, or the Green Coast. The Costa Verde beaches seem natural, only disrupted by a highway, but in fact they are just 40 years old. Gravel and sand dredged from the ocean were packed along the water's edge, and the cliffs are separated from their long-term eroding relationship with the sea, their bodies smothered in netting to keep firm their loose, rocky selves. It is only in the Anthropocene that a single species has the nerve to rearrange the trajectory of rivers, invert mountain peaks into craters, and demand the ocean never again touch the cliffs it spent millennia building up and knocking down. Each time I flew to and from Pucallpa and Lima, I reflected on my 35,000-foot position of privilege. The ability to fly, to traverse continents in a matter of hours rather than days or weeks, has given humans unprecedented command over geography. Yet, these geologic barriers remain firmly in place for many people. Less than 20% of people in the world have ever flown on an airplane. You and I are the Anthropocene's elite. Air travel is one of the most greenhouse gas intensive activities, and the impacts of those emissions are felt disproportionately by people who will never fly. That is the end of my excerpt.
Thanks, Melina. Should I hand over to Zach then? Zach, can I ask you on stage, onto the virtual stage, please?
Yes, thank you, Daniel. Great, so I'll be reading an excerpt from my article, A Quiet Epidemic. I'll give a little bit of background on it because this segment comes from a little further into the article. But this is about a disease called valley fever, which is a fungal disease found in arid regions of North and South America, pretty much from California's Central Valley and a little bit further north, all the way down into Colombia. I'll refer to a few things in this excerpt that I just want to explain before I read it. I'll refer to Cal OSHA, which is California's occupational safety branch. So for context, that's a government organization about occupational safety. And I'll also refer to coccidioides fungi, which are also known as cocci. And that's the fungi that causes this infection. So it releases these spores into the air. The spores travel, and if pretty much anything with a lung breathes them in, then an infection can start and it can begin to spread. 95% of cases, I believe, remain in the lungs. Some of those can be more severe than others, but in 5% of cases, it can spread beyond the lungs and become a severe and chronic infection. So this article really bred of an interest in learning more about this disease that a lot of people believe is spreading due to climate change. So I'll read a small excerpt, and then I will turn it over to one of my interviewees, Rob Purdy. So, despite the fact that well over a century has passed since valley fever was first medically discovered, there is still a yawning gap in awareness and treatment. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, over 15,000 cases of valley fever were confirmed in 2018, more than 7 times the number confirmed in 1998. The exact causes of this increase remain uncertain. Still, it is estimated that over 150,000 people contract valley fever every year in the United States, meaning that well over 100,000 of these cases remain undiagnosed. Many theories have been proposed to explain the sharp increase in cases, which is outpacing population growth in the American Southwest. One of the most likely and concerning possibilities lies in the warming climate. Cocci fungal growth in the soil correlates strongly with extreme weather patterns, and current climate models suggest the fungi's range could more than triple over the next 100 years, while also becoming more aggressive in areas where the fungi are already found. And this is not just a theoretical possibility. A 2013 paper demonstrated that the fungus has spread to Washington state and had already infected several people. Cocci had previously been found north of California. The cocci growths in Washington were several hundred miles outside of the known range, and researchers believe that such jumps could become common in the coming decades. Even though cocci fungi tend to thrive in arid regions, the San Joaquin Valley, which is where this article is focused, where it is endemic, is one of the most productive agricultural regions in the world, producing crops worth over $2.5 billion annually. It is also the site of new investment, as the suburbs of Los Angeles stretch ever inland from the Pacific Ocean, reaching up into the valley. The region's sunny, open landscape promises a bright future in renewable energy. Unfortunately, there are downsides to progress. The San Joaquin Valley has some of the worst air pollution in the United States. Much of the agricultural work is made possible by 500,000 undocumented farm workers, nearly all of whom lack health insurance and basic workplace protections. The threat of valley fever only compounds these risks for those who work outdoors. Until only a couple of years ago, there were no state-mandated requirements for training workers on the risk of valley fever. Lawyer Peter Alford, who successfully represented 5 road workers in a $12 million valley fever-related case against California's Department of Transportation in 2014, was shocked at the lack of worker protection at the time. Companies typically don't do more than they have to. If Cal OSHA isn't requiring it, then they're not going to do it, he said. Alfred's case is one of only many related to valley fever, and to date, the most successful. In 2019, the Regional Federal Court ruled on a lawsuit filed by over 100 prisoners at California's Pleasant Valley Prison. Over a decade earlier, a study had found that inmates at Pleasant Valley were contracting valley fever at 600 times the local average rate. In 2005, the state eventually evacuated prisoners with compromised immune systems, but prisoners continued to get sick in the following years. The lawsuit filed by the inmates alleged that keeping prisoners in the Central Valley, where a breath of dust could give them a debilitating infection, was a cruel and unusual punishment. The final ruling dismissed these claims. The court ruled that because anybody living anywhere in the Central Valley could get valley fever, the state did not have to protect its prisoners against it. And that is the section that I'm going to read. And I would like to introduce Rob Purdy, who that selection does not reference, but he is a big part of this article, and he's been a big part in helping me to understand the impacts of these diseases. I first talked to Rob actually when I cold called the Valley Fever Institute almost 3 years ago, working on a different project, and Rob answered the phone. and was extremely willing to talk. And eventually from that conversation, that evolved into more of an interest in this disease and some of the impacts. And all I can say is I've only barely scratched the surface, but Rob's story is very compelling, I think. I don't want to talk too much for him, but I will say he's currently the Patient and Program Development Coordinator at the Valley Fever Institute in Bakersfield, California, in the Central Valley. That's where he was born and raised. And he was diagnosed with a severe case of valley fever in 2012 and has had an ongoing battle with the disease ever since. So Rob, if you're ready, I'd like to turn it over to you if you'd like to talk a little bit about your experiences and anything else you'd like to share.
Sure, thank you. And actually, because the host covered my video, somebody's going to have to turn me back on. There it goes. Now it's going to start. So here I am. So thanks, Zach, by the way. So, I could easily spend 15 minutes or longer just talking about my valley fever journey, but for the sake of time, I'm going to be very brief in my discussion. So I wanted to highlight that really I was born and raised in Kern County, California, and we're, as Zach said, an area that's rich and has a diverse history and population. My family's roots actually go back to California's gold rush. That's how long my family's been in Kern County. That was the start of Kern County's population boom. And we continue to expand in population. Matter of fact, our population has more than doubled over the last 40 years. Our county is larger in size than the state of New Jersey or the country of Israel. We have valleys, mountains, and Mojave Desert in my county. As Zach said, we have a large ag economy as well as oil and gas, but we're also expanding and we are a leader in green energy, both solar and wind. We have a booming aerospace industry here. We're actually the home of SpaceX at the Mojave Spaceport. So I live in Bakersfield, which is at the southern end of the San Joaquin Valley, which actually is just kind of a large bowl, and now it collects dust and particulate matter. But 100 years ago, it used to collect water, and we were actually home to a collection of inland freshwater lakes and marshes. Bakersfield's relatively new. We were created when canals drained the marshes in the early 19th century. Before that, we were home to the ninth largest freshwater lake in the U.S. And if you guys are familiar with Dust Bowl migration in the 30s or have read John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, that book took place in Bakersfield and surrounding areas of Kern County. So Kern County is very hot and dry. We get less than 8 inches of rainfall every year, and we have extended periods of drought, which have become worse over the last 20 to 25 years. We're definitely not like the California that you would see on TV. We're also the epicenter for valley fever in California. In fact, valley fever was named for the San Joaquin Valley where I live. So after a very rainy 2010-2011 winter that ended a period of drought and a hot summer, conditions that make for an increased incidence of valley fever, I got sick on New Year's Day 2012. As Zach alluded to, if you've read Dr. Goris's paper on valley fever and climate change, she makes a strong case that the range of valley fever is going to expand with these continued droughts in the Western United States. So my story began with a headache on New Year's Day 2012. I was diagnosed with a sinus infection. I went to the urgent care twice, was prescribed unnecessary rounds of antibiotics, finally saw a specialist who told me I didn't have a sinus infection. Next person told me I had cluster headaches. Finally ended up with other symptoms, including double vision. Ended up at the emergency department at Kern Medical, which is now home to the Valley Fever Institute. I was admitted to the hospital in February, where the doctors finally told me I had what's called cocci-meningitis, which is valley fever that has left the lungs and moved into my brain and central nervous system. It took me 6 weeks to get diagnosed, which seems like a long time, and for many illnesses it would be. But for people with valley fever, 6 weeks is actually a pretty short time to diagnosis. Was finally discharged in March of 2012. I lost 70 pounds, lost 3 months of my life, and my symptoms were still there. My headache was still there. My headache finally started to really go away mid-May, June. Still had no energy, no appetite, constantly thirsty, felt horrible. And then in October of 2012, I was readmitted to the hospital because I failed the drugs that they had me on. So was started on a new drug, failed that one 6 months later, started on a third drug, failed that 6 months later. At that point, they added a second drug. So they called it, I failed all the monotherapies. That combination of drugs was successful, but I ended up failing that for a couple of reasons. One, the drug I was in gave me skin cancer. So they moved me to a fourth oral medication and a medication called amphotericin, which they administer to my brain directly through a port in the top of my head. So it's a very difficult disease. And the drugs they use to treat my valley fever, they don't cure it, obviously. They're used off-label. So the methods that they develop to treat me are based on trial and basis and trial and error, really. And they're not used at the approved dosage. So at the approved dosage of these drugs, they say, hey, stop if you experience side effects like fatigue, loss of appetite, or nausea. My doctors tell me, you're going to feel tired, you're going to lose your appetite, and you're going to feel like sick. So, and the cost of valley fever already between California and Arizona, they estimate the cost of valley fever to be about $2 billion annually. And as cases increase, that cost is going to escalate. And then there's the hard to manage costs. I missed months of work. I lost personal relationships. I suffered with depression. I suffered from the isolation. And for most people, valley fever is inconvenient. It's lingering. It's a flu-like illness, and it makes you really tired. What I have is a devastating life sentence, and I'm lucky to be able to have a functional life with it. And because of that, one of my goals is to educate the public and to better communicate the differences in disease severity. So as the patient program coordinator, I get to do a lot of really good things that really for our patient community. I onboard patients, I run our support group, I collaborate with community stakeholders, community events, I work on occupational health and other legislation. This April, we're hosting the COXI study group, which is a collection of researchers and clinicians that are going to be talking about valley fever. And as Zach said, I was diagnosed in 2012. I actually just celebrated my 10-year anniversary of having valley fever this week. And I will continue to take medication for this disease for the rest of my life. Thank you for your time. Hopefully I didn't take up too much of it.
Wow. Thank you so much for coming on, Rob, and sharing your experience. This was deeply gripping and unsettling as well, but it's definitely important to educate more people about this disease. And I particularly thought that Zach's piece was one of the most powerful pieces, or a quite powerful piece of journalism in general within our last issue. So it's very interesting to learn about the background behind the piece. So all the best for you. And thanks for sharing.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
And on that note, I think what we found out at Anthroposphere is that often the stories behind the stories are just as interesting as the stories themselves. And so in that spirit, I'd like to ask Melina if she was able to share a bit more about her story and how she came to the tour of the Anthropocene and what prompted her to write that piece.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Daniel. I think although the work that Zach and I did and do is quite different in a way, perhaps what we were both seeking with our pieces is sort of to make the experiences with environmental catastrophe kind of tangible and personal, especially to those of us who I described as the Anthropocene's elite, for whom we're kind of exempt from living right alongside the frontiers of climate change and other environmental loss and degradation. And so that's when I was working in Peru, I was working with a number of indigenous communities who live alongside the Ucayali River and are experiencing the impacts of changes in flooding and weather patterns, and seeing that wash away their homes and crops every year, seeing the lack of government support. And for a lot of the people that I was working with, the idea of getting on an airplane and flying to the capital city is impossible. I mean, those flights cost $60 US, but people can't afford that. And so while for somebody like me, I can get on an airplane and 60 minutes later, I'm in a completely different environment. For a lot of the people that I was working with, these geographic barriers, but also social and economic barriers are very much firmly in place. And so on this plane flight that I took quite a few times, often with these very spectacular vistas from the airplane, I started to think to myself, I would call this a tour of the Anthropocene, because I could see the these incredible views of the Amazon and the Andes Mountains and the ocean, and then also see all of the human impacts on the landscape, informed by my own knowledge and research that I had been doing. And so I wrote the piece really to try to reflect on this feeling of cognitive dissonance, of wanting to do research that was in some way contributing to doing something about climate change, supporting people who were very much impacted by that, but recognizing that I myself was not really impacted by that. And in fact, just by flying on the airplane in order to do the work that I was doing, I am contributing disproportionately to the problem of climate change that I say that I'm working on. And so my piece doesn't really offer a solution to that. It really is a reflection, a sitting in the cognitive dissonance of that. And that's kind of how I conclude the piece, by really inviting the reader, and I imagine the reader as somebody similar to myself with similar level of privilege and 35,000 foot access, to also sit and think, well, what are other exhibits on this tour of the Anthropocene, maybe where you're feeling that cognitive dissonance or making tangible the impacts of climate and environmental loss.
No, thank you. I completely agree. And I think part of the reason why that piece resonated quite strongly, certainly with me, but also with a lot of the readers that I've talked to, is that it does an excellent job at bringing out that liminal experience, that cognitive dissonance that I think many of us can relate to, and kind of drive out those contradictions that the Anthroposphere and the Anthropocene impose upon us. So thank you very much for sharing. Zach, would you like to share a bit as well about why you were compelled to write that piece about valley fever, how you got in touch with Rob? What's the story behind your story?
Absolutely, yeah. I did touch on this a little bit. A little bit about me also. I grew up in a small town. I worked an agricultural job throughout pretty much my entire high school career. So yeah, about 5 years. And I think I was struck when I started looking into this, when I was first doing a project and just out of curiosity was looking into valley fever as a possible avenue where climate change was having a very big real world impact. And I was just struck by how many different spheres this touched on, and coming from my background, I was surprised at the lack of workplace protections, and just how this ties in so much to all these different spheres. There's a political sphere, there's a legal sphere, there's the medical sphere, there's research, there's everyone's lived experience who gets this disease. And something that I think was my biggest takeaway, honestly, and like I referenced in that segment, is there is that divide between how many cases are reported and how many we think there are. That's 100,000, possibly even 200,000 people a year. And the reason for that is because not many people know it exists. And this disease is being covered on major news networks. There's been segments on it on so many major news networks in the US, on television, on radio, and still people don't know about it. People maybe more so in the Central Valley, but even some people in California don't know about it. And you can get it just from driving through the Central Valley. And I think it's a testament to how our disease control works, at least in this country. I can't really speak to how it works across the pond, but I do think this is, even at 200,000 cases, even if we had every case that existed being reported every year, it would still not reach the threshold for people to invest in a vaccine, which is possible. And later in the article, I talk about how the vaccine is very possible. It's very, the research is there, it all exists, but there's just not the money, and there's not any private investment going into it because people don't know about it. There's not government money going into it because it doesn't reach a certain threshold of people, even though this is hundreds of thousands of people. So I think it's something that really needs definitely a lot more attention.
Absolutely. And I think it also shows how a lot of what we think of as environmental risks are exacerbated or actually just brought into existence by the fact that they are that they are able to confront social vulnerabilities, vulnerabilities in our healthcare system, for example, or poverty, in many cases, or other types of deprivation. Melina and Zach, thank you so much to both of you for coming on here, for reading your pieces, for talking about your pieces. I think this was really a great insight into the type of journalism that we feature, and also the motivations that bring our writers and contributors to write for Anthroposphere. So thank you both so much. And as we close this segment, I would like to hand over to my co-head editor, Vinita, who will take us to the next part of our evening and introduce our next guests. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Daniel. And thank you to Melina and Zach for those two really powerful pieces. And huge thanks to Rob Birdie for joining us as well. We were really privileged to actually feature these pieces in our latest issue. And if you'd like to read them, they're available in full on our website. And if you'd like to support our magazine, please do head over and purchase a copy. Before moving on to introducing our next segment, I just want to say that Anthroposphere is actually a part of the Oxford Climate Society, and we're really thankful to be collaborating today with them on this event. And thank you to the Oxford Climate Society for actually platforming and working with us in conceptualizing this event. Okay, so with that, moving on to the next section. As Daniel mentioned, my name is Vinita, and I'm one of the head editors of Anthroposphere. And we're going to now discuss with a climate journalist and a climate communications researcher about new ways of storytelling around the climate crisis that kind of move away from the traditional narratives of disaster, of glorifying a kind of techno fix, and moving beyond the prism of scientific framing. So we're really delighted to have with us two people who are really important in Anthroposphere's history. First is Shannon Osaka and Carl Dudman. Shannon is a climate reporter at the environmental magazine Grist, with writing also appearing in Rolling Stones, Wired, and other outlets. Her work focuses on US climate policy, electric vehicles, and big ideas about the climate crisis. And I'm personally quite a fan of Shannon's writing, right from her profile of environmental activist Jonathan Porritt in one of the first issues of Anthroposphere, her review of the book Climate Leviathan in the LA Review of Books back in 2019, to her current rigorous reporting and incisive analysis in Grist. Her academic work as well is really insightful on extreme weather attribution. She's received the SEAL Award for Environmental Journalism and an Online Journalism Award for topical reporting on climate change. And most significantly for us, she co-founded Anthroposphere along with Sophia Blanchard while studying geography at the University of Oxford. So it's really special for us to have her here today, and really looking forward to this interaction. Our next speaker is Carl Dudman, who is an environmental anthropologist and researcher of climate change communications. Carl began his communications journey assisting research at Climate Outreach. He's designed and led DEFRA-funded citizen science research in Oxford and has represented Seychelles in the COP dialogues and contributed to several academic and lay environmental publications. His most recent paper on climate communications and the IPCC, in which he talks about reciprocity in climate communications, is really insightful, and where he also talks about IPCC and how it should listen to alternative forms of knowledge. I think he will be talking about that piece of scholarship as well today. He freelances as a writer and photographer, and again, significantly for us, was the head editor of Anthroposphere for a year, just prior to Daniel, me, and Divya taking over. So really excited to have you both. And perhaps we will first start with each of you presenting your thoughts and opening comments on how we address this topic, starting with Shannon. after which we will move on to a Q&A round. To the viewers, please feel free to drop in questions in the YouTube chat and we will pick them up during the Q&A. Over to you, Shannon.
Thanks so much, Vanita, for that really, really nice introduction. And it's really great to be here hanging out with the Anthroposphere people. It's been pretty wild seeing how the magazine has grown and become much more ambitious and way better than it was when I was editing. So I'm really impressed and happy to be here. I am going to share my screen. Let me just set that up. So I'm going to talk a little bit just about the history of climate journalism and where we are going from here. And I just want to preface this by saying this is going to be a little bit of, a sort of Anglophone centric presentation. I'm going to talk about the US and the UK more specifically, and particularly the US because that's where I work. But I think there are many important things to think about in international climate journalism. And I think Anthroposphere has done a great job in sort of highlighting those voices as well. As Vanita mentioned, I'm Shannon. I'm a climate journalist at the environmental magazine Grist. I focus on policy, ideas, and things like that. So I want to talk just a little bit first about where climate journalism has been. So you all may have seen this was sort of a meme that went around a few years ago. It's a clipping from a newspaper in 1912 talking about coal consumption affecting the climate. This is actually an excerpt from a Popular Mechanics article. But so we could say that climate journalism has been around for a century, maybe more than a century. But for our purposes, I'm going to talk more in recent history. So I'm going to talk about the last few decades. So the sort of first period of climate journalism that I think of is sort of early climate coverage in the 1990s and the early 2000s. And there were two, I think, main components of climate journalism, at least in the English-speaking world at that time. One was that at that time, people were mostly focusing on climate in the sense of basic climate science. So if you look on the left here, we have, this is an article in the New York Times about testimony given to the US Senate by James Hansen, who is a very famous climate scientist. And he said, look, global warming is happening, it started. And this actually appeared on the front page of the New York Times in 1988. And, at that point, it was just basic science. Is this happening? And you can see on the right, this article appeared in the New York Times Magazine in 1991. And it says, heating the global warming debate. And it's kind of hard to read, but at the end of the first paragraph, they talk about how James Hansen said that the evidence clearly shows that climate change is happening. And then the next sentence is, does it? Does the evidence actually show that? And that illustrates this other part of climate reporting that occurred at this time, which was something that has been called in the academic literature, balance as bias. And so when we think about journalism, journalists are trained to do a lot of different things. They're trained to be objective. There's a lot of disagreement about what objectivity actually means. Whether it's really possible to be objective, I would argue that it's not. But without getting into that, there is this tendency of journalists to want to tell both sides of the story. And that's something that you're trained to do in the workplace and that you're trained to do in journalism school. And so these two academics, Maxwell and Jules Boykoff, wrote this seminal paper in 2004, where they talked about how this idea of balance was actually creating a bias in both US, in this article is about the US, but they talked about it in the UK as well, that it was basically shifting the argument around climate change more towards deniers. So they say the prestige press's adherence to balance actually leads to biased coverage of both anthropogenic contributions to global warming and resultant action. And I want to show an example. Whoops. This is from the LA Times in 1992, and this is a quote from the article. The ability to study climactic patterns has been critical to the debate over the phenomenon called, quote, global warming. Some scientists believe, these italics are added, and some ice core studies seem to indicate that humanity's production of carbon dioxide is leading to a potentially dangerous overheating of the planet. But skeptics contend there is no evidence that warming exceeds the climate's natural variations. So this is classic sort of balance as bias. The journalist says, okay, well, I have to show both sides. I have to show that some scientists think this and some skeptics don't think this. Now, the problem in the case of climate change is that most of the scientists thought that climate change was happening, and the skeptics were, a group of often fossil fuel funded spokespeople who had maybe some scientific expertise, but not in climate, and who were, being paid or at least encouraged to share these narratives. So this was a really big part of most 90s and 2000s coverage of climate change. Now, in the 2000s and 2010s, this started to shift a little bit. Many journalists at mainstream outlets started to understand that there was a global scientific consensus on climate change, and the coverage shifted to be more about climate impacts. So when you think about weather attribution, which I'm sure many of the Oxford viewers have heard about, since Oxford is a big hub for weather attribution to climate change, things like, these are some headlines: the California drought is made worse by global warming. Climate change made the European heat wave at least 5 times likelier. So a lot of coverage started to come out, both talking about dangerous future impacts of climate change, a lot of sort of doom and gloom reporting, and reporting on things that climate change was doing now. On the right is like a little story that I wrote when I was first interning at GRIST, which was about how there had been a shift from sort of this view of climate change as being sort of far away, a global problem happening to polar bears and the ice caps, to its extreme weather, and it's happening now. At the same time, there was a growth in specialty publications that were specifically focused on climate change. So Carbon Brief and DSmog, which are here in the UK. Carbon Brief covers a lot of essential climate science. DSmog covers climate denial. And then a few in the US, Inside Climate News, GRIST, where I work, Yale Environment 360. So there was this growth of these specialty publications taking on many aspects of climate coverage, and taking on many aspects of climate coverage that mainstream outlets weren't necessarily doing. Because in a lot of mainstream outlets, and this started to change in the 2010s, but a lot of mainstream outlets, coverage was still really kind of siloed in the science desks. So that meant that the only things that would get covered would be sort of emerging new studies, which can be useful, sort of emerging dangerous, disastrous impacts, and not very much on the solution side. So these specialty publications emerged that started to fill in some of those gaps. At the same time, there was growing attention from some legacy media outlets. So on the left is an image from The Guardian when they did their Keep It in the Ground campaign. I believe that was in 2015. And they were really, The Guardian took a very strong stance and has historically been very strong on climate, and been very strong advocacy group on climate in terms of saying, we need to divest from fossil fuels. And on the right is an image of the New York Times Climate Desk. The Climate Desk was started in the mid-2010s and now employs about a dozen reporters. And so there's been sort of growing attention over the last years. And so I want to think a little bit about what's next and where climate journalism needs to go from here. So one thing that I have noticed hugely while working in the climate journalism space is that literacy on climate change, its causes, is pretty good. I mean, and Carl's going to talk about some of the ways where it might not be good, and some, there are still many pockets of climate denial. But I think in general, among sort of educated, interested people, they understand climate change is here, it's caused by carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions. But there's not very much understanding about the sources of emissions and solutions. So this is a piece that I wrote just at the very beginning of the pandemic called "The World is on Lockdown, so where are all the carbon emissions coming from?" And it was a really, really simple piece. I just described the fact that, just because there were no cars on the road does not mean that our emissions have gone away. We still have all of these other sectors of emissions. And this ended up being, in a totally bizarre way, the most viral story that GRIST had ever had, because many people actually really didn't know where the sources of emissions were. They didn't really understand sources from power generation or sources from industry or other transportation sources that were not them driving their car down the street. And so that's sort of a way to demonstrate that understanding of solutions and sources is really not very strong. So at the same time, we have seen a lot of news desks. This is sort of, I'm going to talk about some US-centric ones here, but they're also international, are starting to really invest more heavily in climate. The Washington Post is adding 70 new positions this year, 20 of them in climate. CNN created its own climate desk for the first time last year. The Associated Press announced today, I think, that they were adding 20 positions to a newly formed climate desk. So there is a lot of interest on the part of, mainstream publications to tackle this issue. They're seeing how important it is. But the questions that remain are basically, who should journalists be trying to reach and with what kind of content? Should we be continuing to say, okay, here are the scary impacts of change that we're going to see? Should we be, warning people about 2030, 2040 deadlines? And I'm just going to give a little bit about my philosophy here. So the way that I think about climate reporting now is that I think that climate reporters should try to reach an interested but non-expert audience. This is sort of at least what I try to do. Explain solutions, technologies, and the barriers in their way. Center people in climate impact stories. And I'm so glad that we had Rob here to talk about his experience, because I think that that's exactly the type. We've seen a lot of coverage that has been, disaster coverage that's coming in the future, or general stories about attributing weather extremes to climate change. But it makes a big difference for readers when you can center an individual person's experience. And I think that that's something that is only really now starting to be practiced in climate journalism. And then I think about things that I don't necessarily want to highlight in my coverage. So I try to avoid what we might call, in the academic context, climate deadlineism. So saying, we have 8 years before we have to fix climate change or everything is going to be a disaster. I think there's a lot of truth to that in terms of keeping warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But at the same time, I worry that, and I have seen in some people that I have talked to, activists, young people, that it does breed a kind of, a kind of willingness to just say, okay, we have 8 years left and we're probably not going to make it, so I guess we should just give up. And that's the absolute opposite of what we want to do in climate journalism, is that every degree matters and every 1/10 of a degree matters. I also try to avoid doom and gloom. I think that we are at the point where a lot of people understand that there are really bad impacts of climate change, and we just need to explain what the solutions are. And to some extent, I also try to avoid sort of us versus them narratives. This is particularly important when thinking in a context like the US, where we're still extremely polarized on the issue of climate change, although less than we were in the past, and where we do still have climate denial. Because I think, and I believe as Carl will talk about, there's a lot of really complex social and cultural backgrounds to why people believe certain things about climate. And, saying, okay, these people don't believe in climate change, so they're just stupid or ill-informed, is not the right way about it. And then I'll just give a couple examples of things that I've reported on recently that I find are interesting. I've written about, is the US government, is the US democratic system particularly bad at tackling climate change from a policy perspective? I've written about attempts to create citizens' assemblies in France that ended up having huge conflicts with President Emmanuel Macron. And so these are some of the things that I think are interesting, of trying to really parse, okay, here are the battles over policy that are happening right now, the really essential policies that we need in order to combat climate change. And here's why they aren't happening. Here's where they're getting held up. So I hope that that was helpful in terms of just describing where I'm coming from in climate journalism and a little bit of the history. And I'm excited to take questions from people going forward. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Shannon. I think that gives like a really good overview of, historically how climate journalism has evolved, right from the front page covers that you showed of the newspapers to what's happening today. And I think that gives like a really holistic view of how that's happened, especially in the US and the UK. Okay, so I think we will move on to Carl's presentation before we move into a discussion section. So Carl, would you like to make your comments?
Sure, thank you, Vinita. And yes, thanks, Shannon. I hope that this will be a good segue. I'm going to talk very briefly about some of the research that I've been doing in my PhD on climate change communication in the US. And I'm going to run through that very, very quickly because there's not much time, but really going to focus in on some of those questions, especially about things like skepticism. So I will share my screen as well. Always a fraught moment. Can you see that okay? Oh, I'll just. Okay. So like I said, I'll run through this extremely quickly. A quick caveat is that I am now in the US halfway through my field work in North Carolina. So many of these things are just kind of early impressions and themes that are emerging, but much can still change. So take everything with a pinch of salt. My interest in climate change communication and in this thesis started in 2017 with a curious collection of maps that I amassed from across the internet. And I like to show people this because it really gets to the thing about the complexity of the climate change story in any given society. So this, some people might be familiar with, is a public opinion poll that is conducted every year by the Yale Program for Climate Change Communication. And it's a county level survey asking people all sorts of questions about how engaged they feel or concerned they feel about the matter of climate change. And you'll see that it's a very spotty map. The more purple, the more, the less concern people express, and the more green, the more. Compare this map to another one, which was made the next year. And this one is a sort of scientific and economic assessment of the likely impacts of climate change in the US. And I'm focusing on the east side here because that's where my research is. I do care about the Westerners as well. But yeah, and you'll see that there really isn't a lot that these two maps seem to have in common. One showing that basically the further south you get, the more trouble there's likely to be. And the other one painting a very different kind of picture altogether. And so a kind of confusing story seems to emerge. And when you add a third one, something else is added. This is actually the 2016 presidential election results, also by county in the US. And you'll start to notice that one of these maps looks a lot more like the public opinion one map than the other. And it starts to show that there is a story here, a hidden story, one that I became captivated by. And I thought, you know, I became frustrated that this was kind of just a headline of a story. I wanted to know who was going to try and tell it, and was anyone trying to tell it? So in the aftermath of the 2016 election of Donald Trump, there was a great deal of public interest in trying to explain what had sort of gone wrong, you know, by a lot of very concerned liberals. And a lot of news and media sometimes try to rationalize the actions of voters, trying to sort of get to the bottom of what had happened. And kind of from a sort of top-down sort of way, whilst others were outright dismissive, such as that headline saying that, you know, Trump supporters engaging with them isn't productive. And there was this kind of widespread move to kind of abandon people and either try and explain them from the outside or else decide that they're kind of not really worth engaging with. And I bring that up because it spills over into the climate change world as well, where even with the UNFCCC, who is the sort of global political center of climate politics, didn't really have any answer to give about how to engage, continue to engage with the US after Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement, other than to say, well, you know, if you ever change your mind, you know, you can come back. But otherwise, there was this kind of resounding silence and even a sort of defiance as people got on with the job. So at every level, there was this confusion about handling this curious story, and rarely any input from those places themselves that you know, were being affected, but no kind of voice that wasn't sort of heavily mediated by an explanatory sort of narrating voice. So I started to wonder if people being shut off from the high-level conversations about climate, whether that was really as much about society as just the communities who aren't getting on with the climate change narrative. So that became the basis of a PhD. And I ended up going to coastal North Carolina, which is where I am this year. And in particular, doing work with communities who are at high risk from sea level rise, but don't necessarily have the easiest relationship with the climate change narrative. So I'm interested not just in what they think and how they rationalize that, but in how they interact with a whole network of scientists, coastal management, decision makers, local representatives, journalists, campaigners, etc., federal agencies, to put together this kind of joint a working understanding, how they go about navigating that tricky topic of coastal flooding with the people who actually live there. What language do they use? Do they talk about climate change, or do they have to frame it as something else? What works and what doesn't? What compromises end up getting made? And do people feel listened to? So that's the kind of basis of my research. I'll just throw out some very early conclusions that I'm coming to. One being that there really is no single thing called climate skepticism. It's a name, a handle that is used a lot in journalism, in writing, in all sorts of discourse. But when you kind of press it, it sort of bursts into a lot of different things at once. So, people have many reasons to feel reluctant to talk about climate change or frame their day-to-day experiences that way. And in my interactions with rural, mostly working class people living on the coast, or others who have close relationships with them, I've heard many different rationales being used based on the different kinds of experience. So one being trauma. My house keeps getting flooded or damaged or blown away by successive hurricanes or storms. I know that eventually my community is going to wash away. I don't want to talk about this right now. It doesn't affect me day to day. We'll deal with it eventually, but it's too much. How can I sustain this level of trauma every day? I'm much too busy. I'm trying to feed my family. I don't make enough money as it is. I can't dedicate time to these sort of high level, agendas when I'm just trying to sort of live day to day. These kind of meta narratives are just, not relatable. Fatalism, a lot of people living on the islands that I'm working in, it's kind of a ticking clock for people. And so, why push for some grand effort on a sort of national or global level when, there's nothing that I can do as an individual? And then mistrust. A lot of communities have felt historically like they haven't been paid a lot of attention by central government or by people in other countries as a global community. Whenever outsiders get involved, they always mess things up. So why would I want them sort of sticking their nose in this time? So treating skepticism, I think, in today's sort of public forum, it's very easy to shout first and ask questions later. But instead of going straight to calling people, anti-science, closed-minded, uneducated, uncritical, immoral, selfish, whatever, this is fairly rarely a fair representation, and it sort of flattens a complex and diverse human set of experiences into something quite two-dimensional. So treating skepticism as a category of its own is a slippery slope, and I think it should be taken as a prompt for more listening, more communication, rather than less, which can be the response instead. And then a second conclusion is this one, that everyone is biased. There is a kind of very fundamental, very basic asymmetry that plays out in the ways that people's actions and views get categorized in the world of climate change. Most climate communications efforts are directed at understanding the biases and the values of people who don't get along with the climate narrative. What are their values, their sort of psychological things in play? Why don't they get something that is so sort of scientifically obvious? But there are social and cultural factors beneath pro-climate actions too, and they can be just as mired in their own biases and assumptions as well. So I'll try and quickly run through this. But when an issue like climate change becomes completely partisan, as it pretty much is, or at least has been in the US, one political community gets a monopoly over how it is defined and understood. And science becomes tied to a suite of other, pretty much otherwise unrelated issues, although arguably they are all interconnected, but there's no particular reason why one should be, paired with the other. When Donald Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, a bunch of mayors, cities, states in the US banded together to kind of reaffirm their support for the United States responsibility in the Paris Agreement. And, these were almost entirely democratic strongholds, cities and states, brands, where climate change had already had strong public support. So the story of non-state climate action in the US has really developed as something looking very urban, very engaged, and very democratic. So for people who don't belong to that sort of political community and live in different conditions and a different set of values, climate action becomes just as illegible to them in a way as they have been to mainstream climate action. So with the new Biden administration, there are big new government funding schemes prioritizing communities that are underserved or disadvantaged, are two terms I see a lot. But who is underserved in society very much depends on, or changes based on who it is that you're talking to and whose opinion you're seeking. So things like these are ambiguous categories that have to be defined by someone before money gets spent. There's a history and a politics behind those terms that matters and so shouldn't be ignored. Another example is various climate adaptation projects that I've seen on the coast that are designed to help communities in trouble like the one I'm looking at. And they often have conditions for eligibility that makes it easier for some communities than others to take part. So things like this, proactive, locally driven, equitable approach to coastal resilience, grassroots action and co-production are really popular concepts and very important ones too. But if a community isn't already raring to go and has enough time and capacity to make funding pitches, brainstorm ideas and sort of special meetings, then they may end up getting left out. So I'll just finish with some quick, top-level conclusions there. There is no right side of climate discourse. Being on what feels like the right side doesn't mean that you have an unbiased, complete picture. And these biases can reinforce boundaries of engagement or disengagement and shape the sort of national, even global map of engagement. Communication means more than just education, and it involves being able to challenge one's own assumptions as much as feeding information to somebody else. And so, taking those conclusions on, I just want to leave you with this quote that I love from Darling, who says that whenever you're finding your own story about climate, you have to leave caricature behind and wade fearlessly into complexity. So I'll leave it there. I'm looking forward to questions.
Thanks so much, Carl. I think that was so insightful. Really thinking about communications as a really academically rich discipline, and looking at climate apathy and in such a different way. And yeah, so I really am looking forward to questions now, and we're already getting in some questions from the audience, and I think this question would be interesting, I guess, for both of you. And so they ask, how do climate journalists combat availability bias, that is interviewing and sourcing only the most salient and powerful actors versus local indigenous people who have valuable knowledge regarding environmental solutions, but maybe harder to reach? So Shannon, if you would like to answer, and Carl, if you had anything to add.
Yeah, I think that this is really something that I wanted to talk about, but didn't quite have the time. Is just, journalists are very responsive to concepts of authority. And again, that's one of these like journalistic norms. You should talk to experts. You should talk to people who know the most about the subject. And that usually ends up being policymakers, scientists, people at think tanks, sometimes people at NGOs. And it creates, it creates a particular milieu of people that you're selecting from. And I think that in recent years, there has been more emphasis, particularly among particular American media outlets covering climate that I know of. GRIST has done a huge pivot towards trying to address environmental justice issues, which includes Indigenous issues, and creating relationships with those communities such that we can report on the work that they are doing environmentally, working on things like Indigenous prescribed burns to prevent wildfires. I mean, there's a huge wealth of knowledge there, but I think it is difficult. And I think that it's part of in a lot of areas of journalism right now, there's this incredible push for speed, for views and clicks. And when you're facing that kind of pressure, it's difficult to take the time to go out into communities, to meet people who have different types of expertise and learn how to cover and respond to those types of expertise. So I think that it comes down to somewhat of the business model of journalism. And I think that for me, thinking about the growth of nonprofit environmental journalism is really positive, because I know that those outlets are able to take the time to embed people in particular communities and cover these stories.
Yeah, it's actually funny because, you know, what I'm used to thinking about in anthropology is kind of the opposite issue, which is the question of studying up, as it's called, which is that, you know, the question of access when you're doing some long-winded study or ethnography, it makes it much more difficult to get an audience with people who are kind of more powerful or, you know, working in sort of higher up spaces. And so there is this kind of bias towards communities and you know, the don't have that same scarcity of, you know, time. And I think it's the same, you know, it's the same thing though, in a way, because anthropology is all about the deep story, whereas a lot of journalism is about getting things done really fast. And, you know, you just can't represent people and the complexities of communities and society when you have to get an instant quote. Often it takes a lot of, you know, trust building and the long, hard, you know, work of building that relationship. So how you get around that, I'm not sure. I'm not the journalist, so I'll defer to Shannon's answer on that.
Yeah, that was really interesting to actually get two different perspectives on the same thing and coming at different angles. Like, we do know that a lot of you know, it's a problem in both ways sometimes. Like the business model of journalism is such that you're kind of feeding the beast, and you know, you just don't have time, and you have you have some set of contacts whom you usually reach out to, and actually and it only depends, only if you get like a huge grant or something can you actually go out and do a lot of in-depth reporting. And while at the same time, in anthropology, there's the issue where, you know, there's very little elite anthropology nowadays that's happening, and it's largely studying communities that are vulnerable and are more accessible in that sense. So that also poses another kind of challenge. So just moving on to this question, I mean, that kind of is a nice segue into talking about asymmetry in climate communications. And I was just wondering, Carl, how do we think about asymmetry in climate communications? You didn't mention that in your presentation, but in what ways is the current modes of climate communication asymmetrical, and how do we fix it if there is a fix?
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, that is pretty much exactly was the subject of the recent paper that a colleague and I had published that you mentioned earlier. And the basic argument of that is that yes, you know, climate change communication has come on leaps and bounds over the last, you know, 10, 20, 30 even years. But there is still this sort of fundamental asymmetry within it. So, a very basic principle in climate change communication is trying to reach beyond this deficit model, which I'm sure a lot of the audience have heard of, which is basically the idea that, if people will get on board with climate change if we just give them more more relevant information. They just need more science and they'll get it. Well, that's been debunked for a very long time, and so a lot of climate change communication is trying to spend a lot of time with people, trying to understand why they come to the conclusions that they do. But my argument would be that that isn't actually enough if all you're going to then do with that information is just find new, more clever ways to feed the same scientific information to people. It's still a flow of information from, one high up authoritative group of people to other people who don't quite understand what's going on. So, I don't think that's a completely hopeless situation, though. A lot of the work that is done in climate change communication can be sort of remodeled to serve a more kind of reciprocal, dialogical conversation, because communication is dialogue. It's a conversation where people both speak and listen. So if you do this in-depth study about some coal miners in West Virginia and why they're reluctant to talk about climate change, instead of then just kind of using it to make a new framing to talk about science, you can actually present that to the wider community of policymakers, politicians, journalists, society at large, who need to actually themselves be educated in why this is a sticky subject for some people, why there are matters of equity or this or that. So often it's not a process that we have to start from the beginning with. Often it's just about reformulating work that communication is already doing, but with a new kind of framing, so that you're not kind of always focusing on bringing science to people, but also acknowledging that there are sort of social and cultural facts that also need to be understood by the rest of society.
That's a really interesting point about how a single kind of framing. And on that point, I actually want to turn it to Shannon to ask, do you think journalism today relies heavily on scientific framings of climate crisis to deliver a story?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I think that it definitely varies by outlet and sort of where the types of reporting that people are doing. But I think in general, yes, if you look at overall, it relies on two things. I think one is the scientific framing and one is a little bit of an international framing. Because if you look at how climate media coverage plays out over time, like graphs of issue attention over time, the things that create spikes are large IPCC reports and climate conferences. So those are really the things. I mean, there's some spikes for extreme weather events and things like that, but that's pretty much drowned out by these other components. So I think that overall, there is a very large scientific framing. I think even when we're thinking about things like recently, like COP26 in Glasgow, a lot of things were being framed around this, climate deadline, get things done by 2030, 1.5 degrees. And all of these are kind of, these sort of interesting, like combination metrics that are built up from science and policy and a bunch of different actors sort of working together to identify a goal. So I think that it is really motivated by that. I don't think that that's the best really way to frame all of climate journalism. I think that there are important scientific framings, but that there's also very important policy framings. I think questions about, how much should we be addressing climate change through new technology versus things that we think of as more natural. That's sort of an emerging area of tension within the climate space. So within the space of people who think that we need to take action. And I think I just want to sort of bring up one more issue, which is, I think that there is this sort of long-standing idea that we need to kind of deal with the climate change belief problem before we go on to discuss policies and solutions and all these things. And I don't really think that that's true. And I think that one of the things, and I think this relates to what Carl is talking about as well, but like people can engage with different types of climate communication and journalism, whether they are necessarily fully on board with the concept of human-caused climate change at all. So people can be interested in stories about clean energy, stories about wind power, stories about electric vehicles, stories about, even to some extent, about climate impacts and, changes that way. And I think that that's a way to sort of get at this community of people who aren't necessarily clinging, to every scrap of climate news, but who are still interested in these developments that are happening in the policy space.
Carl, do you have anything to add to that or to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you brought that up, because one thing that I had wanted to talk about but didn't feel I had time was that, a lot of the interaction that happens between people working in coastal management, climate scientists, policymakers, and the people in those sorts of coastal communities is, they have to talk about this stuff. They have to talk about flooding. They have to talk about adaptation. There's no time to sort of say, well, I'm only going to, talk to you when you'll admit that it's climate, or, so there are all sorts of interesting ways that people, work around the awkwardness of some issues like this. People, instead will talk about overdevelopment in their local area, or, even as simple as sort of framing it as coastal erosion rather than, climate induced sea level rise. There's this sort of play of language that takes place between all the different actors working in that area, and as Shannon says, it is very possible to continue to conduct a lot of these sort of important kinds of conversations without, with climate being a very large sort of climate shaped elephant in the room. There are probably going to be wider implications to that as I'll kind of go on to investigate, but it is true that people do have these sort of workarounds, and progress of sorts can be made.
Carl, one of the questions from the audience is that you had mentioned, among other things, you're investigating what works and what doesn't work in terms of communications. So what are the parameters, what parameters do you use to measure success, if you could give any examples?
Well, funnily enough, I mean, I guess my answer would have been what I was just talking about, but it's a very sort of real and tangible thing when you're looking at what's happening on the coast. There's a kind of longer term discussion to be had about mitigation, and whether we can get everyone behind a sort of public consensus on climate. But when it comes to adapting to climate change, the results are kind of very much there, and whether infrastructure is being put in place, whether things are changing, whether people's homes and livelihoods are being protected, it's very tangible. So success is kind of easier to manage, to measure in that sense. And so I think wherever there are parts of the coastline where there are active plans in place, conversations being had, a kind of language that is palatable to all of the people who are involved, then that's a success of sorts if it leads to some sort of change. But then as I mentioned in the presentation, there are all sorts of cases where there is this lack of visibility to between the different parts, and so people are kind of left not really knowing what to do and not having any kinds of protection. And then that's just adaptation. Of course, if we're going to solve this climate riddle as a nation, as a planet, then there's a kind of what is success in terms of learning to deal effectively with something like climate skepticism, or whatever you want to call it. That's a much bigger question. I don't really know what the sort of long-term way to measure that is, but I'll let you know in half a year.
Sure, we'll be waiting to hear that. Shannon, there's a question from an audience member who's asked, how has the pandemic changed climate journalism?
That's a good question. So I think that, yeah, it's a really good question. At the beginning of the pandemic, I think that there was this view. I want to say a couple different things. The first is that I think there's a view that climate change is somehow this like really unique communications problem, that, you know, it's unique in how polarized it is. It's unique in that there's this huge scientific consensus, and yet we still have denial and we still have little policy action and delay and things like that. I think that that was a strong belief before the pandemic, at least among like climate journalists. And there was sort of these moments early in the pandemic when I had just started working as a reporter, where a lot of journalists said, you know, what we need is we need a COVID type response to climate change. Like if only we could take these like massive economy-wide changes and apply them to climate change. There was this moment of like, you know, if we could only do this and treat climate as a true emergency, then look at how far we would go. And then the result, you know, 2 years on, is that there's so many actual parallels between the way that the COVID crisis has played out and the way that the climate crisis is playing out. Despite the fact that COVID is this much more emergent problem, it still is provoking these various forms of polarization. It's still provoking all of these questions about, okay, how seriously should we take scientific knowledge? What is the role of science in telling us risks? And what is the role of science in telling us what risks we as a society or as individuals should be willing to take? And so I think that while there was this initial feeling that, oh, you know, COVID could mark this change in how we think about and act on climate change, ultimately COVID started to resemble climate change much more closely than I think many of us would like. So I think that is a big thing that many journalists have sort of had to grapple with over the past 2 years. I think that on a broader sort of societal level, I do think, and I don't know how to measure this, and maybe Carl, maybe you can do some work on this as an anthropologist, but I do sort of wonder about how people's impressions of disastrous sort of once in a lifetime events have changed, because this was something where I personally really felt it at the beginning of COVID, that like, look at how fragile our society and systems are, such that something as small as this virus can really overturn so many plans, change our supply chains, complicate so many things about our lives. And I think that that's something that climate journalists have been warning about, and, you know, scientists have been warning about, and social scientists. But it's different when you see it play out, even if you see it play out in a different setting with a different issue. And so I think that I hope that people are sort of realizing a little bit about like the fragility of this like extremely interconnected world, and thinking more about, okay, these past 2 years, it was COVID. What is it going to look like in 10 years where we're really facing some of the worst impacts of climate change?
Yeah, that's super interesting. And just to add to that, I kind of remember in the beginning, at least this was in India, and I'm bringing that perspective in, when there was the lockdown happening. And I think you touched upon this before, but the visibility of the problem. And so initially there were so many articles about nature healing itself, and how, you know, now we can see the mountains from the cities, and that just because of a certain level of visible pollution kind of moving away. But at least in developing countries, not everything is articulated in terms of climate change itself. And, you know, you have all of these other environmental problems and socio-environmental problems, which are not articulated in terms of climate change. And so, yeah, those kept happening, and environmental regulations by governments as well kept changing for the worse. And so these articles kind of masked what was really happening. And yeah, so it was very interesting, the problem of visibility. So we're short of time, but I just want to pose one last question actually to both Carl and Shannon. Given your involvement with Anthroposphere and the work that you both have done with the magazine, I kind of just wanted to understand, as both of you were involved, what was your vision for the magazine in breaking the norm of climate reporting and communication? We've talked a lot about some of the problems and asymmetry of climate communication. We've talked about scientific framings, techno-optimism, the problems with that. But where did Anthroposphere kind of embody your vision of what climate communication or journalism should look like, and what kind of stories should be told, and how do we tell these stories? Whoever, Carl, if you'd like to go first.
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question. I think ultimately, you know, for me and you know, for Josh, who was the other head editor, when I was involved, it was, you know, climate change is not something for some people. It's an issue that has endless dimensions, and there are more stories implicated in climate than can ever be told. And I think, you know, then what was important to me anyway was that more of those stories, perhaps surprising stories, unexpected stories, need to come out if it's ever going to be something which everybody can sort of get behind and you know, learn to address and deal with. So I think trying to reach into unexplored or, you know, surprising corners of climate discourse and move away from the usual tropes and welcome more kinds of climate stories that people who previously maybe couldn't see themselves in could now do so, was what has always been important to me. And I think that's what we try to do, and what I've continued to really value in the work I've done since. So I guess that's my answer. Hopefully that's something we achieved. I'm interested to compare that to the kind of founding, you know, ethos that Shannon, the vision. I don't know if we've successfully carried on your vision, Shannon. It's probably arguably the more important one of the two.
No, I think that jives a lot with what Sophia and I were thinking early on. I think that for me, I was frustrated by the fact that, and might sound kind of bad, but that there was a lot of these, you know, doom and gloom disaster stories, you know, this many droughts by this year, this many hurricanes, you know, and all of those stories I think were important. They were scary. And there was a level also at which I felt that they were becoming boring. And boring for people who are interested and fascinated by climate change, boring for people who are just, you know, casual readers of The Guardian or the New York Times. And so I think that when I think about the climate journalism that I want to see, and that I think we were hoping to do with Anthroposphere, was, you know, really interesting and complex interdisciplinary work that went beyond these really standard narratives that we see every day in the news, and those narratives that are easy for journalists to do because they're sort of top of mind. You repeat them over and over every day when you have to cover the next news. But really wanting to go beyond that and show people that, you know, I mean, when I think about climate change, I think, okay, climate change is the most, in my mind, you know, the most, or at least one of the most important issues facing our generation. But it's also just an incredibly interesting issue, an incredibly interesting policy problem, social problem, cultural problem, scientific problem. And I think it's a shame that more people don't realize that. And I think that journalism has sort of failed the public if they have not made it clear that climate change is such a fascinating topic to dig in on and try to decide what you think are the right options moving forward, the right things that we need to do to sort of basically remake our energy system. So that's kind of what I was hoping that Anthroposphere would do, which is a very, very tall order.
No, definitely. And I mean, I think every successive edition has tried to tell these stories differently and try to live up to this ethos that you did put together. So I think that brings us to the end of this event, and it's been so good to actually speak to both of you, to bring both your perspectives in, your expertise, your research, your writing, and, you know, have this kind of a discussion on where we're really at the moment in terms of climate communications and journalism, and like with Carl's perspectives, kind of digging in to looking at various social cultural problems, and also like looking at framing of climate change and how that travels. And from you, Shannon, also learning about, how historically, how things have been and where we're going right now. And it's been a really interesting session, and thank you both for joining us. I just wanted to also thank Melina and Zach for reading out their pieces. It was a really good slice of what Anthroposphere does and what we try to do. And thank you to the OCS team, especially Andy, for conceptualizing this event with us. And a big thanks to the teammates at Anthroposphere for pulling all of this together. And a big thanks to our audience. I hope this session has given you a lot to think about. So thank you all, and good night to all.